Dave Talks Comics, Episode 115, Heroes Con 2016, Part 3. Welcome to Dave Talks Comics, the program where I talk about comic books, cartoons, and comic book conventions. Most episodes are a mix of summary and opinion and include spoilers. Please keep that in mind. Spoilers. All past episodes can be streamed or downloaded from the program's website, davetalkscomics.com. This episode continues my coverage of Heroes Con 2016. I will be talking about my experiences on Saturday, the second day of the convention, who I talked to, panels I went to, things I bought, and so on and so forth. You can find my blog posts on HeroesCon 2011 and 2012 and podcasts on HeroesCon 2014 and 2015 at davetalkscomics.com. Look for the name HeroesCon in the conventions section on the right-hand side of the page and click it. You might have to scroll down a little bit to find it. Day 2 of HeroesCon 2016 is more or less over for me. Certainly my day at the convention is over. The convention itself is closed. There is an auction tonight, but I'm not going to that. I haven't eaten dinner yet, so I'm getting ready to go out and do that once I'm done making this recording. The day started with breakfast at the hotel. I didn't get a ton of sleep. I didn't get to bed until maybe something like 1 last night. I didn't finish recording last night until about midnight. And then I was up for like about another hour. And then I got up at, 5:30, 6 o'clock. So I think I got about 5.5 hours sleep. And it showed at one point during the day when I didn't start to nod off, but I was definitely yawning a bit. I hope the people on the panel that I was at were somewhat understanding. But so the day started with breakfast. I had breakfast once again at the hotel. I thought about going out and I even looked for places to go. I found a couple places that aren't too far from the hotel, within a couple miles, a short drive. But I decided to just eat at the hotel. It's included with the price of the room. And the food wasn't too bad yesterday, and it wasn't too bad this morning. I had some scrambled eggs and bacon and an English muffin and a waffle with some syrup and some juice. And it was decent, I probably could have gotten a better meal if I'd gone out, but this was free, and so you've got to factor that in. And it certainly put something in my stomach and was enough to keep me going for a few hours. So when I was sitting at breakfast, I noticed the TV was on, and there was some talk about disruptions or traffic disruptions, and that there was going to be a 5K in the downtown area of Charlotte. So when I got back up to my room, I looked into it. I found out that it was mostly be just in one part of the downtown area, and so then I tried to figure out, okay, well, where should I go to park? And so I drove in, and I ended up driving around quite a bit in the downtown area. There's a lot of one-way streets in downtown Charlotte, and I got kind of turned around. I almost got into an accident at one point because I wasn't paying attention. I started to shift lanes without really looking to see if anybody was there. Actually, I had looked, and there wasn't anybody there, but I waited maybe 10 seconds, and then I started to shift, and by then somebody had come up. And so the guy honked the horn, and I stopped shifting, and there was a red light, and so I stopped, and he didn't look at me or shake his fist or anything like that, but he kept going, and so then I turned, was trying to make a left turn at that point, and even that didn't get me to where I needed to be. And I ended up parking much further away from the convention center than I needed to. I paid $5 to park. I certainly, if I'd been willing to pay a few more dollars, I could have parked much closer. I think there was a garage right across the street from the convention center that was only $5 for the day. But I was just, I don't know. So I parked in this lot that was way up about 7 blocks from the convention center, totally unnecessarily. But so when I got into the convention center, one nice thing that I noticed was that and I don't remember this from prior years, maybe this was the case, but they had a quick line for 3-day pass holders. So at first when I walked in, one of the convention staff told me to get into the line that was up there, but when I got to the back of the line, somebody else told me, oh, I see you've got a 3-day pass, you can go down there to the 3-day pass entrance. And so there was no line at the 3-day pass entrance, and it was just 11 o'clock, the time that the show opened, so I was able to go right in, and I didn't have to wait in a long line to get in. Just as I walked into the convention hall, I saw two of the guys from Comic Geek speak, Pants and Murd. And so I stopped, and they were talking to somebody, but that guy moved on pretty quickly, and so I talked to them. I didn't want to hold them up. They were looking to do some back issue purchasing, and they actually were going to one of the dealers that I'd been to yesterday, the Acme Comics booth. But I talked to them a little bit about, to see what they'd been up to and if they'd been here yesterday. And so, it was just kind of nice to say hi and talk to them for a couple minutes. After that, I decided it was time to pick up my commissions. I had 2 commissions. I think I mentioned those on a previous podcast. The first one that I picked up was the one that Chris Schweitzer was doing for me, and I think that's the first one that I ordered. And he was offering to do a Versa sketch. I can't remember if he called it a Versa sketch, but it was something like that, where basically he would do a sketch of just one person, or he'd do one of 2 people fighting. And so I asked one of 2 people fighting, and the sketch he did for me was of Doctor Strange and Kulak. And those were my requests. And Doctor Strange, of course, is a Marvel superhero, and Kulak is a DC supervillain, a rather obscure DC supervillain from the Golden Age, although he did appear in All-Star Squadron, and he may have had a couple of other appearances along the line. He was, I believe, an enemy of the Spectre or Dr. Fate. But he came up in the episode where I talked about All-Star Squadron issues 27 and 28 because he was the big bad guy in those. So I was curious to see what Chris Schweitzer would do with those 2. They're both magicians or wizards or whatever the proper term is. And it's a shame that he didn't color it. That wasn't part of the deal. It was just, pen and ink. But it would have been nice because there's an interesting color scheme. I mean, Doctor Strange has a kind of a blue and red color scheme for the most part with a little bit of gold. Kulak, on the other hand, has a green and yellow. I don't think it's a gold. I think it's a paler yellow or maybe a brighter yellow. But I wouldn't call it a gold scheme. And he's got blue skin. And he's got 3 eyes. And there's different ways, and I talked to Chris about it a little bit, about the ways he could have done it, because in some images, if you do a Google image search for Kulak, you'll see him as this giant figure. And so that's one way it could have been done. And one of my favorite covers, and this is not related to Doctor Strange or Kulak, but one of my favorite covers from when I was much younger was the cover to X-Men number 3 or 4 or 5. It's the one that shows the X-Men small and Magneto and the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants large, looking down at them. And I've always loved, I think that left some sort of an impression on me. And so I saw a possible way that Chris could have drawn this would be, you would just see Kulak's head. You wouldn't see most of him, and he would be striking at Doctor Strange, like beams out of his eyes or something like that, and Doctor Strange throwing up a protective spell. But that's not what he did. which is fine because I really like what he did. I had seen it on Twitter. He had tweeted it out, all the commissions that he'd done. I wasn't, and I'll say it looks a lot better in person than it does on my iPhone screen. The other commission that I had to pick up, before I get to that, I also talked to him about the Krogan's Adventure series. And I asked him for, what the story was, because there haven't been any new books, since 2014 or 2013 or something like that, or maybe even 2012. And certainly nothing since the last time I saw him, which was last year at Heroes Con. So I was curious as to what the story was, and he told me that he was, I can't remember exactly where he's at in the process, but he's gotten a good deal of the next book done. But a possibility that he mentioned to me is that they might break it into 3 books and then presumably eventually publish it in a complete volume. But he also said that he might include some short stories in with those, with the individual issues if they decide to serialize it in as a 3-parter. And he talked a little bit about these short stories, and he said they would be like about 15 to 20 pages, and they would be other Krogan's Adventure stories. So I'm curious to see, I'm eager to see this, and he said he hoped that within 6 months that there would be some sort of an announcement or some sort of a decision, I think. I'm not sure which it was. So the other commission that I had to pick up was from Joey Weiser, I think the only thing of his that I've read is Cavemen in Space. I think that's what it's called, which he did several years ago, and I bought from him at SPX at least 5 years ago, I'm guessing, which is a lot of fun. And he did a sketch of a commission of Samurai Jack and Aku for me last year, which I liked very much. And so this year I asked him to do Yatsuba, who was a character from a manga series of the same name, a little girl, and Spaceman Spiff. And so he did a very nice. He may have tweeted it out, but I didn't go looking for his tweet of this. So I had not seen it until he gave it to me. So, but it's a very nice commission, and I'm very happy with it. And he pulled in something from one of Yatsuba's stories, which is this head. There's a cardboard robot. It's not really a robot. It's more of a robot costume that somebody is wearing in one of the Yatsuba stories. And, of course, Spaceman Spiff, one of the things which is from Calvin and Hobbes, one of the things that he likes to do is he jumps in this cardboard box, and that's his spaceship. It's also at one point, I don't think when he was Spaceman Spiff, but when he was pretending other stuff, or maybe it was his transmogrifier is the term I recall. And so in this commission, he's got Spaceman Spiff in the box, and Yatsuba's behind him, and it's so it's the box that from her story, but it's similar to the box that he would use, and it's kind of neat how, of course, boxes, how little kids sometimes use boxes to play games. So, and I talked to him a little bit about his series, his Merman series, but I decided not to get anything just yet. I'm not sure. I really would like to buy something more than just commissions from him, though. I really would. I really should probably just take a chance and buy the first volume of Merman. After that, I decided to go upstairs to the first panel of the day that I went to, which is the Spotlight on Steranko panel. I got there early because I wanted to make sure I got a good seat. As it turns out, it was in a much bigger room. If it had been in a smaller room, it might have been packed. But considering the size of the room, it was, there was maybe 40 or 50 people there. I'm not sure exactly because I was sitting in the front row because I wanted to tape it, which I did. And actually, you know what, I'm going to save the rest of this for later because I'm going to do a separate recording about the panel. So after the Steranko panel, I decided I was getting hungry, so I went to lunch. I walked basically back to the car, or almost as far. The place I went to was like 2 blocks from where I parked my car, a place called Local Loaf, which was in the 7th Street Market. And I had, as with all of these places that I go to for meals around here, it's some place that I found on Yelp. And it sounded good. It got good enough reviews, and I was looking for a sandwich or something like that. So I went up there. I had a Cuban sandwich with a side of pickled cucumbers and a root beer. I sat outside because there wasn't any tables available inside when I got there. It was a little breezy, but it wasn't too breezy. Nothing, blew away like a napkin or anything like that. And it was, when I walked up there, I actually walked along the street I can't remember which street it is, but I walked along the street, so I had to stop occasionally at stoplights because there was cross traffic going through that had the light, and so it took me a little longer. And what I could have done, and what I did do on the way back to the convention center, was I walked along the Lynx tracks. There's actually a pedestrian walkway that goes along the Lynx tracks there that takes you all the way back to the convention center, and I think you have to cross a couple streets, but you also avoid crossing a couple others because the Lynx train goes over like a bridge or something like that, and so does the pedestrian pathway. So I got back. I had some time before the next panel. I think I had about 45 minutes. So I wandered around a little bit. I ended up doing a little more back issue bin diving. I picked up 8 issues. And these are things which are not on my list, but I picked up 8 issues of X-Men Classic. And there's a couple reasons why I picked them up. I picked them up because they have Mike Mignola did the covers on these, on the reprints, because that's what X-Men Classics are. They're reprints of X-Men stories. And these issues are the ones from around like the late 50s into the 60s, the late 150s into the 160s of the run of X-Men. And it includes some issues from the Brood Saga storyline, the original Brood Saga storyline, and also the issue where Dracula shows up, the issue with where the story of when Professor X and Magneto fought Baron Strucker, and also the issue where Illyana gets pulled into limbo and ends up spending something like 10 years there, and with Belasco, and that's when she becomes magic. I read all of these issues. I had a subscription to X-Men, the original versions of these. I had a subscription to X-Men when I was a kid. And I really enjoyed these issues. I got rid of them at some point. I sold them for considerably less than they would have been worth. I think I sold them for less than they were worth even at that time. I can read these on Marvel Unlimited, but I really do love the Mike Mignola covers. And I'm not sure exactly how many covers he did. I bought 8 issues, and and then I checked because it occurred to me after I bought these and walked away that I might already actually have some of these already. So I checked, and of the 8 that I bought, I already had 4 of them. Now, I only paid 75 cents an issue, so I paid $6 for 8 issues. So I could have saved myself $3 if I hadn't bought all of these, if I checked first, checked my list to see what it was that I actually have, because I do have everything, or just about everything that I own in Comic Book DB. I have a list of, 2,500, 3,000 comics, something like that. So, which is what I did afterwards, but, too late at that point. It was only $3. It's not like it's not like I spent $5 an issue or something. But they're very nice covers. I really do like these Mignola covers. I have to find out how many of them he did, because I don't think he did them for more than a year at the most. But I do have a few holes in there where I'm missing some issues, 2 or 3 issues. So there may not be more than 3 or 4 more of these. I'm not sure. So after mistakenly buying more issues of X-Men Classic than I should have, I went back upstairs for the second panel that I was going to, which was the Romance Comics panel. And as with the Spotlight on Steranko panel, I'm going to record separately on that. I did take notes. I also made a recording of this panel. And I will talk about that after I'm done talking about the rest of today. So after the Romance Comics panel, I went back downstairs. I did some more back issue bin diving, and I found a dealer that had some $2 Bronze Age comics, boxes of, 10 boxes, 15 boxes of $2 Bronze Age comics. And I was actually finding some things in there that I was interested in, things that were on my list. And so I went through all of them. They also had like Silver Age comics, but those were not $2. They also had magazines. I decided not to go through those because I was running short on time for the next panel. But what I did pick up, I picked up 3 things. I picked up New Adventures of Superboy number 9, which is an issue that features some of the Phantom Zone criminals, Jaxer, General Zod, and Feora. And there's a reason why I'm interested in them, and that's because I have been reading some Superman Adventures comics. These are the comics that are based on Superman the Animated Series that feature Phantom Zone criminals. And probably my next episode of Dave Talks Comics that's not about Heroes Con is going to be about some of those stories, because I've been reading some of those, and I want to get that stuff out. So I picked that one up, and I think it's the only time that the Phantom Zone criminals appeared in the New Adventures of Superboy. I also found Marvel Team Up Annual number 4, which is written by Frank Miller with art by Herb Trimpe, and I think Mike Esposito did the inks. And in this one, Spidey teams up with Power Man and Iron Fist, Daredevil, and Moon Knight. And the story is called Pawns of the Purple Man. And the Purple Man is, of course, the villain from the first season of Jessica Jones, although he doesn't look anything like David Tennant in this comic book. I haven't read it yet, but I did take it out and flip through it. So we'll see how that is. I haven't heard any. I don't know. I mean, it's written by Frank Miller, so hopefully it measures up to the caliber of some of his better work on Daredevil. I don't expect it to be as good as Born Again, but hopefully it's a good story. It's from that era, I believe, around the time that he was working on Daredevil. I can't recall exactly which year it is. Hold on, let's see. I've got the comic right here, and it's out of the bag. It is from 1981. Yeah, I'm pretty sure he was working on Daredevil at that point, but I'm not sure if he was writing Daredevil yet at that point. He may have been, because when he started on Daredevil, he was just the artist. He was not. He was just the penciler. He was not writing the book. And then the third comic that I picked up, and all 3 of these were on my list, was Marvel Premiere number 49, which is a Falcon story. It's a solo Falcon story. I think this is the first solo Falcon story. He had appeared, of course, in Captain America quite a bit, but this is from before his miniseries, which I guess would be his first story in a title that had his name on it. And I talked about the Falcon miniseries, I believe, on the very first episode of this podcast. So I'd been wanting to pick that up because, he's a character he was a member of the Avengers. He was I don't want to say sidekick, but he was it was kind of like, Green Lantern and Green Arrow, or, wait, there was another example, or Green Arrow and Black Canary. He was somebody who was a partner, a crime-fighting partner of other people, but didn't really have his own book very much over the years. And so that, I enjoyed his appearances in other things. I enjoyed the Falcon miniseries, so this is one of these characters I want to go back and find these appearances, these interesting stories from, and I actually do want to read some more of his appearances, his first appearances in Captain America, And also the first story, because when he first appeared in Captain America, he didn't have the wings. Those showed up later on, a few years later. And so I'm planning to read those at some point. They're all available through the Marvel Unlimited. So that's all I bought at that point. And after that, I went to the Creatures Imagined and Real panel. And this was the mega panel. They do one of these every year at Heroes Con. And I will talk about that more in a little bit. Once I got out of that panel, the show was almost ready to close for the day. We had about 15 minutes left before they would start kicking everybody out. But I wanted to get a T-shirt. I wanted to get the Heroes Con T-shirt, and I decided to take a chance. And I went downstairs, and I went to the Heroes Aren't Hard to Find booth, where they were selling it. And I've got to say, the staff there, not everybody, but most of the staff there, seemed to be more interested in studying their tablets or their iPhones than they were in making a sale, because when I walked up to the table, nobody said anything to me. Nobody even looked at me. They were just kind of staring at their tablets, doing stuff. I'm guessing it wasn't business related, but I'm not sure. But I finally got somebody's attention, and I did buy a T-shirt, and it's the one designed by Brian Stelfreeze, which has the Black Panther on it, and it's the Heroes Con T-shirt. I think this is only last year I got the Indie Island T-shirt, but this year I like this T-shirt more than the Indie Island T-shirt. And 3 years ago, the year that I didn't come to Heroes Con, I was able to purchase the Heroes Con T-shirt by mail, and actually that's what I'm going to wear tomorrow at the show. Today I wore a Hawaiian shirt, my green Hawaiian shirt, and some khaki chino shorts. And of course I've been wearing hiking boots at the show just because you spend a lot of time on your feet, although honestly I probably haven't spent anywhere near as much time on my feet because I've been spending time in panels more so than other people. So after I bought the T-shirt, I left the convention. I walked back along the Lynx tracks to basically most of the way to my car. I actually overshot. I wasn't sure exactly where I needed to turn. I actually went a block too far and had to come back down a block. But I didn't have any trouble finding it. My car was there. It was a little warm because it had been out in the sun all day. I think the temperature got up to close to 90 today. But after making some notes about what I'd done, I got in the car and I drove back. And now I'm getting ready to go to dinner. And after dinner, I'm going to I'll talk about that in a little bit. After dinner, I'll record a little more about what I had for dinner. And then I'm going to make some recordings about the panels. And those will probably be relatively short. I'm not going to try and summarize everything in the panels. I'm just going to try and give a basic rundown, because I do have recordings of all three panels, even though my recording of the third panel got cut short. And maybe I'll talk about that in a little bit. A couple more thoughts before I get into my descriptions of the panels that I went to today. I just got back from dinner, and I had an excellent meal at Ben Tan, I think it's pronounced. It's Benthanh. It's a Vietnamese restaurant. It's in Matthews, North Carolina. It's about 2.5 miles from the hotel where I'm staying. They used to be located much further north. Like 15 miles north of there, something like that, in Charlotte on Central Avenue. And I went there in either 2011 or 2012 and also had an excellent meal, very similar to the meal that I had tonight. I know that night both times I had the pineapple fried rice with shrimp, and they serve it in a scooped out half of a pineapple. And that was excellent once again. I had summer rolls, and I can't recall if I had summer rolls or maybe spring rolls the last time. The difference being that the spring rolls are fried, the summer rolls are not. And I had hot tea this time. I think last time I had the jackfruit drink, which is quite good, but it's kind of filling also. And I certainly had enough to eat tonight. I'm not stuffed, but I don't need to be stuffed. So that was an excellent meal. Definitely a place I would recommend if you're in the area near Matthews, North Carolina. Just like the place I went to last night, the Tamarind Fine Indian Cuisine, something like that, which I went to last night. Also excellent. Both of them are in Matthews, North Carolina. So I'm back from the restaurant. I looked up my collection of X-Men Classic. I checked to see how many issues that Mike Mignola did the cover for. He did the cover for 14 issues altogether. Issues 57 through 70. And I have 9 of those 14 issues. I'm missing 5. I'm missing 57, which the first one, and I'm also missing the last one, 70. The first one is the Kitty's Fairy Tale story. The last one is, well, it's not the end of the Brood saga, but it's close to the end. It's the double-sized issue, which is, it's the final battle, and I think at the end of that issue, or at the beginning of the next issue, the X-Men are back on Earth, but the Brood, they're not completely done with the Brood, but they are out of outer space. And the other 3 issues that I'm missing are issues 59, 62, and 68. The first panel that I went to today was the Spotlight on Steranko panel. That was at 11 o'clock this morning. And before I get into describing that panel, I want to tell a story about Jim Steranko panels. And that is that 2 years ago, I was at Appleseed Comic-Con in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and Jim Steranko was there, and there was a Jim Steranko panel. Now, the person who was interviewing Jim Steranko that day was Jim Rugg. It may have been Jim Rugg and Ed Piskor. I know that they were both there. They're both from Pittsburgh, but I'm not sure if it was Ed. I know that Jim Rugg has a podcast called, I think, Tell Me Something I Don't Know. I think that's the name of the podcast. I've listened to a few episodes. I don't listen to it regularly. I'm not even sure if he releases it regularly. But it's an interview type podcast. And because Jim was the one who was doing the interviewing at the panel in Fort Wayne at Appleseed Comic-Con, I assumed, I didn't have anybody tell me this, but I just assumed that they would be taping it for the podcast. And so I didn't go. I think it was also partly because I had just gotten out of one panel and I wanted to spend some time on the show floor. Now that's a much smaller Comic-Con than Heroes Con is. But still, I wanted to spend some time. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I believe that was my reason for not going. And of course, it wasn't until much later that I found out that I'd blown it and I should have gone to the panel, because there was no recording made of the panel, or if there was, it was never released as a podcast. I suppose I could go and I could look and see if maybe something was eventually, but from what I know, nothing was released. So this time around, I decided I had to go to this panel. I wasn't going to skip this, because I knew. I felt like there was very little chance that it was going to get recorded in this case, especially if it didn't get recorded in that other case. So this panel was basically, it was a two-man show. It was Jim Steranko and his interviewer, who was a guy who has worked with him in the past, who's a writer, not a comic book writer. Well, actually, I think he has done some comic book work, because I think he said something like that. Even some drawing type work, not just writing. His name is J. David Spurlock. And they talked about a number of things. They had a nice little banter going at first, although eventually it kind of got to the point, it got a little tiring eventually. Not awful, because I think Steranko did considerably more talking than Spurlock did. But it felt a little sycophantic on the part of Spurlock, and that probably is not fair of me, but there was also a certain amount of the audience playing up to Jim Steranko, and even Jim Steranko encouraging the audience to do so, which always kind of rubs me the wrong way, because I'm somebody who is, I really don't like the idea of worshiping other people. It always rubs me the wrong way, whether it's me or somebody else. I don't. Doing the worshiping or being worshipped, I'm uncomfortable with it. Jim Steranko is a very talented guy. He's done all kinds of things. He told all kinds of stories about things he's done. He's not just a comic book artist. He is also, I believe, a musician. He was also a stage magician. He was also an escape artist. And he told stories about some of those things. He has been rated one of the top cover artists, one of the top comics innovators, and one of the toughest men in comic books. And he is not a big guy at all. He talked a little bit about how he learned to read through comics, with some help from his mother. He talked a little bit about his background, about how he came from a very poor family, his love to read and to learn, and how he could sit and be entertained by just a pile of books for hours on end. He talked about the influence of Dali's piece, The Persistence of Memory, which is if you don't recognize it by that name, you might recognize it by the description of the melting clocks picture that Dali did. He also talked about the impact of Rhapsody in Blue, another piece that both of these, he said, had a profound impact on him. And there was people in the audience who shouted out things like, "Dali stole from you." This is Salvador Dali, I believe, Spanish artist. He told then he told a bunch of stories. Now, I should say that this panel it was basically just a collection of stories. It was basically just Jim Steranko telling stories to the audience of about, 50 people, maybe more. I was sitting in the front row. I didn't look back to see exactly how full the room was. I'm fairly certain that it was not packed. There certainly seemed to be empty seats to my left and right, but it definitely seemed like most of the front rows had quite a few people in them. But I'm just not sure if it was like that going all the way back in the room. And like I said, it was a fairly big room. So he told stories. He told stories that showed that he certainly appreciates the sort of attention that he's gotten from fans, the sort of attention that people have given to him over the years, the thanks that people have given to him over the years for the impact that his comics had on them when they were young, when they were growing up, how much they appreciated his comics. And then he went on to tell a bunch of other stories about, not just people that he'd met who were appreciative of his comic books over the years, people who were in positions of power, people who were not in positions of power. He told stories about people that he'd worked for or worked with, like Gardner Fox, Walter Gibson, the creator of The Shadow. And I think some of these are people that he worked with, not necessarily in comic books, but he wrote a book on the history of comic books. And I have not read it. I can't remember the exact title of it, but I think that's where his connection to Gardner Fox came in. I'm not sure exactly where his connection to Walter Gibson came in, but he told some interesting stories about Walter Gibson. Walter Gibson was a very prolific writer. He wrote something like 280, or maybe it was 230 novels in his lifetime. I don't know if all of them were The Shadow, but I think quite a few of them were. And he also talked about this idea that something happens, some people nothing happens to them, and other people everything seems to happen to them, and that he feels that he falls into the latter category. And he went on about this, and you really should listen to my recording of the panel. And I think the audio probably came out very good because he was clear. The microphones were working well. I was sitting in the front row. I have not gone back to test it or to listen to what I recorded in its entirety, but I think it should come out fairly good. He told stories about the making of the Hulk 100 title. This was the Hulk cover, which shows the Hulk carrying the Incredible Hulk logo on his back. He's bent over and he's carrying it on his back. Tells a story about how that came to be, and I think there was also a story about how it, not just how it came to be, but also how of him delivering this cover to the Marvel offices. And then he told some stories about, he told a story about working as an escape artist, where he was, as a teenager, escaping, being tied down onto a Ferris wheel and escaping from the Ferris wheel as it was turning. And there were some other stories in there. I mean, it was very entertaining, but it definitely, and I mean, I laughed a number of times. I smiled quite a bit. I applauded along with the audience at various times. I didn't really care for some of the ways that some members of the audience were playing up to Steranko, but on the whole, it was an entertaining experience. I'm not sure if I would go to a Steranko panel if there was one at Baltimore this year, or if there was one next year at Heroes Con. Although I get the impression he's not the kind of guy who likes to repeat these things too frequently in the same circumstance. So I think there's probably a good chance there won't be another Steranko panel at Heroes Con in the near future. Maybe 5 years from now there will be. I don't know. So that's it for my description of the Steranko panel. And if it sounds interesting at all, then I encourage you to keep an eye out for that. It will show up in this same feed. If depending on when you're listening to this, possibly it already has. The second panel that I went to today was the Romance Comics panel. And before I get into that, I wanted to say something about the way I've been taking notes at these panels. It has not been uniform. I probably took more notes at this panel than I know I took more notes at this panel than I did at either the panel immediately before it or the one immediately after it. I'm not going to read through all my notes, but it was very easy to outline. It was very easy to, I felt like they provided a lot of information, and there were some panels where it's just not that simple. So this panel was made up of 5 people. The moderator was Craig Yo, who's a publisher of Yo Publishing, that's spelled Y-O-E. He was part of the reprints panel that I went to yesterday. The other panel members were Michelle Nolan, who is a writer who wrote the first and possibly only general history of romance comics called Love on the Racks. June Brigman was also part of this panel, who is an artist and writer who has done work in superhero comics, Barbie comics, Brenda Starr, and Mary Worth, which are both comic strips, and is an instructor at the Savannah College of Art and Design, SCAD. Jackie Nodell was a member of this panel. She is a blogger who writes the blog Sequential Crush, and she's been doing that since 2009. She has a Kickstarter going right now, although I didn't make notes as to what the Kickstarter was about, and she's also the granddaughter of Mart Nodell, who was the creator of the Golden Age Green Lantern, Alan Scott. The final member of this panel was Megan Levins, who is an artist who works on Ares and Aphrodite, and she also has a webcomic, although I didn't make a note of what that webcomic is, but it's Megan Levins is her name. There was a number of themes that ran through this panel. The first, after we got through the introductions, we had an interesting room shift because they were hoping to get a projector hooked up and show us some images, although I don't recall and I didn't write down exactly what those images would have been, whether it would have been images from old romance comics or it would have been images from some of the artists' work, the artists who were on the panel. After introductions, they got into what got you into romance comics. That was the question that Craig Yo posed to the other members of the panel. And not all of them were interested in comics from when they were younger. Some of them got into comics as a way to make a living, which is specifically June Brigman's case. And some of them were more interested in other things, not necessarily romance comics, but slice of life comics or shoujo comics. Shoujo, which is Japanese girls comics. Michelle Nolan said she got into romance comics because they were inexpensive. Unlike when the prices for other vintage comic books were going up, romance comics, not today, but years ago, 20, 30 years ago, romance, nobody wanted old romance comics. They were practically giving them away. In addition to talking about what got them into romance comics, there was a number of questions or a number of names that were thrown around. Some are familiar, like Frank Frazetta and Matt Baker. These are artists who are much better known than to an informed comic book reader like myself. They're both names that I know. To other names that I was completely unfamiliar with, like Tony Abruzzo and Ann Brewster and Lily Renee, Ruth Roach. But then there was other names like Robert Kanigher, who had edited a lot of the romance comics for DC. And these names came up in various ways. Sometimes it was when they were discussing something. They would talk about a particular writer or artist. They would get into talking about a particular writer or artist, and sometimes it was a question from the audience that would bring somebody. Sometimes it was the audience members wanted to know, what about? Who were some of the women that were actually working in comics? And there weren't that many early on. There was some debate about when romance comics actually started. Craig and Michelle disagreed over what was exactly the first romance comics and whether it was 1946 or 1947, although they both agreed that, and this is something that Michelle brought up, that at one point in the early 50s, 1 in 4 comics was a romance comic. So there was a glut of romance comics at one point, which I don't think you could say that today. Another theme that ran through the panel, it was a subject that came up on a couple occasions during the panel, was the way that romance comics changed over time from the 40s to the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the sorts of subjects that were covered, the sorts of resolutions that you would see in romance comics, the sorts of characters that you would see in romance comics, how certain publishers handled romance comics. The themes would vary sometimes from publisher to publisher, or the way themes were handled would vary from publisher to publisher. One common theme was don't have a career, and this was directed at women, not at men. And this was a reflection of the time in certain ways. There was a little bit of talk about how women, married women, were expected to give up their job if they had a job before they got married. There was a little bit of talk about African American comics or comics featuring African Americans. There was one comic book called Negro Romances. There was another one called Soul Love that they discussed. Another artist that they mentioned was John Romita Sr., who got his start basically, I'm not sure if it was doing covers or doing interior pencils for romance comics, and his opinion of romance comics, of working on romance comics, not necessarily of the comics themselves. And they also talked a little bit about some of the suggestive titles of romance comics, the suggestive terminology that was used in romance comics, and was it done in an ironic way? Was it done in a very tongue-in-cheek way? Were the people who were writing this, did they really know what they were saying? Were they poking fun? Or were they completely oblivious to it? I mean, how have certain words changed over the years? Words like gay, words like threesome, did they mean the same things 70, I guess 80 years ago? No, not quite 80, about 60, 70 years ago in the early days of romance comics. Did those terms mean the same thing? And Craig Yo actually talked a little bit about he's done some research into the I don't know if etymology is the right term, because etymology would be the origins of words, and I think, but he's more done research into how words have changed over time. So there was a lot of things that they talked about in this panel, and I thought it was very interesting. I don't have a lot of experience with romance comics. I've read a little bit, but nothing compared to superhero and some genres, and it was eye-opening. And I definitely think it's worth a listen if you're interested in any way in romance comics, or if you're open-minded and want to learn more about romance comics from the Golden Age through about the Bronze Age. The third and final panel of the day that I went to was the Mega Panel, this year's Mega Panel, which was run by Craig Fisher, and the subject of this panel was creatures real and imagined. Now, the Mega Panel is usually divided up into, I don't know if it's always 3 parts, but this year it certainly was. And the first part was an interview between Craig Fisher and Gabriel Ba and Fabio Moon, who are twin brothers who are comic book creators. Originally, they were just artists, I believe. Well, actually, I believe they were creators. I mean, they were both writing and drawing their own comic books. But then when they got into working in American comic books, I believe originally they were just doing artwork. They weren't actually, although even as just doing artwork, they were probably involved in the creation process and doing more than just actually drawing. But I don't think they were credited as writers for a little while. He was talking to them specifically about their work on BPRD, 2 runs of BPRD, 1947 and Vampire. He wanted to know what he didn't really talk to them about anything other than that, but he wanted to. He mentioned some of their earlier works, like on Casanova, which I have not read. I probably should at least give it a try at some point. But he wanted to know what their opinion was of Mike Mignola, the creator of BPRD and Hellboy, and what they thought of him as a designer of creatures. Craig also asked them about their opinion of Guy Davis and what Guy Davis did for them. And they said something along the lines that before Guy Davis, they couldn't really imagine themselves creating things in Mike Mignola's Hellboy BPRD universe. And the impression I got is that Guy Davis kind of opened their eyes to the possibility that somebody else could effectively, and I guess in a way that didn't smear or tarnish the world that Mignola has created, could also add things to this universe. They talked a little bit about, at Craig's prompting, contrasting the differences between the 2 stories, between 1947 and Vampire, in the way things were visually presented, the way the story was visually told. And they talked a little bit about the influences of their vampire creatures in the 2 tales, where they got their ideas, and what both their investigations into various things, their research that informed the story that they ended up writing. So that was the first, and that ran about, I think, 25 minutes. That was the first part of the panel. The second part of the panel was a presentation by Ben Toll. He's working on a new book. I'm not sure if it's a webcomic or, because his last book started as a webcomic. His new work is called In the Woods, and for the first time he's using anthropomorphic characters. In other words, animals that appear in some ways to be like humans. And rather than talk about his book or his new series, I'm not sure if it's a book or a series that he's working on, he instead talked about the history of anthropomorphic characters and the ways in which they're portrayed and have been portrayed in various comic books and web comics. He showed some images from District 14, which is a French comic book, which I am not familiar with. He went way back to the 1800s and showed images from an artist named Jimmy Swinnerton, who did some, I don't know if these were books or just cartoons, but something called Little Bears. And there was another cartoon strip that he had some images from this same artist, from Jimmy Swinnerton, but I didn't catch the name of that. But it's certainly in the recording, which I did make. He talked a little bit about Crazy Cat by George Harriman, which is a very well-known, well, it's a very important comic strip. And maybe one of these days I'll actually get to go to a panel on Crazy Cat. That would really be neat. I don't recall if I've missed any panels on Crazy Cat. Probably SPX would be the place that something like that would happen. But he talked about funny animal comic books, and he also talked about some of the origins in the origins of funny animals there are racist caricatures and how it started there, but then it began to develop and went beyond that and got much more interesting. And this is all, I think, in the 30s, the 20s, and the 30s that we're talking about. And he showed images of things like Steamboat Willie, which was the original Mickey Mouse cartoon, I believe. Then he jumped ahead to the 1980s and showed some images from anthropomorphic comic books from that era, like Usagi Yojimbo, Dalgota, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and Omaha the Cat Dancer. He also showed some images from some web comics and talked about them a little bit. He talked a little bit about the European funny animal tradition, in which I believe that one I mentioned before, District 14 would have fallen into that category, and also Black Sad, which is one of the few that I actually have read, or at least the first Black Sad book I have, and I have read that, although I got it when it first came out from, I'm not sure who published it, if it was Image or Dark Horse or some other publisher, about probably over 10 years ago at this point. And it's a great noir story, but with all sorts of different animals in the place of humans. He talked a little bit about a manga series called Apocalypse Meow, which is set, of course, during the Vietnam War, and in which the various countries' soldiers are represented by different animals. He kind of wound down by talking a little bit about Richard Scarry, who is an artist and writer that I am familiar with from my youth, although I haven't read anything of his anytime recently. And he talked a little bit about clothing references and how difficult it was to find good clothing references for anything that's not set in the present, and some of the resources that he used to find those clothing reference images, because the comic that he's working on now, In the Woods, is actually set in the 1990s. And so he wanted to make sure that the fashions reflected that era. And he showed us some examples on the screen of what he had come up with, some of his characters or prospective characters or prospective designs for his characters. and what they look like. So that was the second part of the panel, all about anthropomorphic characters. Now, before I get into the third part, I should say that I forgot to put my phone in airplane mode. And so I only have part of the third part of this panel. Somebody or someone called. I didn't even notice it while the panel was going on, but somebody or someone called. And so about 19 or 20 minutes in to this third part, and I think it ran for about 40 minutes, the phone stopped recording because the phone rang. So the voice recorder stopped recording, unfortunately, and I didn't notice until the panel was completely over, and I went to save the file, and I saw that I'd received a call, and then I saw that the time that it had recorded for was about 20 minutes short of how long it should have been for. But the third part of this panel was moderated by Jenny Law, who is a librarian and a writer. Let me see, I'm looking at the program guide here, a contributor to Women Write About Comics. And I guess that is a publication of some sort. I don't know if it's a journal or if it's a fanzine, I'm not sure. Or if it's a blog or a website, maybe. But the subject of this, she had three panelists with her, Bill Stout, Bud Root, and Dustin Harbin, and they have all done things working with drawing dinosaurs. And so she was asking them questions about dinosaurs, like what's your favorite dinosaur to draw? What are the things that you've made up in the process of drawing dinosaurs? How have you filled things in when you didn't know what went there? William Stout told a funny story in the middle of all this about having a T-Rex skull, and which was pretty good, which I did which is on the recording. I've checked to see where exactly it cut off. And the next thing, which is the coloring of dinosaurs. They talked about the coloring of dinosaurs, and there was actually scientific basis. They actually have information. I did not know this at all before today. They have information from some remains of dinosaurs as to exactly what their coloring was like, so they no longer have to guess about some of the dinosaurs. Now, unfortunately, this is about where the recording cuts out. So all I have for the rest of it are my notes. The name Sylvia Cherkis came up. She is an illustrator and someone who does stop motion animation, who has played an important part in the images of dinosaurs. And unfortunately, I don't have anything to go back to listen to see what else there is. Jurassic Park. I have not read Jurassic Park, the novel. Of course, I have seen the movie, but apparently William Stout is credited by Michael Crichton, the author of Jurassic Park, as an influence in create Jurassic Park, because William Stout has been doing this for quite a while. Just from looking at him, I'm guessing he's in his 50s or 60s, and he's been an artist who has been working for quite a while in drawings of dinosaurs, and he not only does work in the field of, he not only draws them, he also gets into the science of it. And not that he's a scientist, but he's actually gone out to archaeological digs. He actually has bones of dinosaurs. And actually one of the things he told, and I think this was probably in the section that I no longer have, or which did not get recorded, was he told a story about going out to a place it was in Canada. I cannot remember which province in Canada it's in, but there was a place in Canada where there was just a glut of dinosaur bones, dinosaur corpses. And they're not sure exactly why there's so many in one place, but they think that maybe there was a flash flood or something like that in a box canyon, and the dinosaurs got buried in mud or something like that and drowned very quickly. And that was an interesting story. They talked a little bit about scaling and how you show, when you're drawing a dinosaur, how do you show how big it is? What do you put in the picture with it? How can you give the impression of its size, whatever its size might be? Because part of the problem there was that the vegetation was different back then. There was, you can't put them next to a human because there were no humans, I mean you can, but it depends on how historically accurate it's supposed to be or scientifically accurate it's supposed to be. There was an audience question about paleo art and science education. Apparently there's some controversy over this, that if you show dinosaurs with feathers, it somehow hurts interests in scientific education, and I didn't completely understand that, why that would hurt scientific education. And honestly, I think some of the panelists were a bit perplexed. They admitted that they had heard this before, but they were still not completely understanding why some people felt that this would cause problems. And there was definitely, there is still, because dinosaurs have been shown to have feathers based on archaeological evidence, but there are still a lot of people, including people in the film industry, and I guess possibly in television also, who when they are doing things where they're depicting dinosaurs don't want the feathers in there. And they didn't really get into a whole lot of why they don't, but presumably it has to do with impressions that they have from when they were growing up of how dinosaurs were supposed to look. That's what I would think. They talked a little bit about shrink-wrapped dinosaurs, and what they mean by shrink-wrapped is the idea that the skin would be tightly wrapped around the bones. I mean, what else could there be under the bones, muscle or cartilage or other things how would those things define the exact shapes that dinosaurs would take? And that was all I thought that was all very interesting. And there was a little bit of discussion about, apparently William Stout had worked at one point on a movie that never came to pass. It was a Godzilla, he described it as a Godzilla movie. I'm not sure if it was really a Godzilla movie or not, but he talked a little bit about the work that he had done on that. And then finally the other thing that they talked about was Steve Bissette had done a comic book called Tyrant, which was supposed to be, I think it was supposed to run for 12 issues, but there was only 4 that were ever published. And it was about Tyrannosaurus Rex. I think it was supposed to track the life of a Tyrannosaurus Rex. And I'm not real familiar with the work of Steve Bissette. I have heard the name numerous times, so I know that he's a comic creator. But I really don't know his work. I did look up quickly the book on the Comic Book DB, and there are 4 issues listed there, and you can see the covers to those issues there. So that basically wrapped up the Creatures Real and Imagined mega panel. I thought this panel was very interesting and very good. It was probably in some ways, it was a good mix of both entertaining and kind of nerdy. I haven't always loved the mega panels. I think sometimes they're stretching a little bit, or maybe it's just sometimes the subject matter just doesn't appeal to me as much as something like this. I felt like I was taking a bit of a chance on this, but I think that they did a really great job. Unfortunately, like I said, I'm missing like the last 20 minutes of the panel. My recording just stopped, and that's entirely my fault. But if this sounds interesting to you, the conversation with Gabriel Ba and Fabio Moon about their work on BPRD, the Ben Toll's history of anthropomorphic characters, and a little bit about his book that he's working on, Into the Woods, or the first part of the discussion on dinosaurs and drawing dinosaurs, then I strongly encourage you to give this a listen, and I will be releasing this soon, or possibly it's already been released, depending on when you're listening to this. So it's getting close to midnight on Saturday night, the second day of Heroes Con. The con is obviously closed. I did not go to the auction. I'm not sure if it's still going on at this point. But the con is almost over. There's just one more day to go. It's a little anticlimactic sometimes, but I'm going to try not to do too much more spending. I think I've done a pretty good job with my spending. There are a couple things that I would like to at least take a closer look at and possibly buy. I've only gotten 2 art pieces, the 2 that I mentioned that I got from Chris Schweitzer and Joey Weiser. I'm planning to go to 2 more panels tomorrow. I'm not sure when I'm going to eat lunch because both of these panels are so close together, and I think one's at noon and the other's at 1:30 or something like that. So I'm not sure how that's going to work out. And I'm not sure when I'm going to... I've got a long drive home afterwards. It takes me about 8 hours or more, usually about 7 hours of driving, 7 to 7.5 hours of driving to get home, plus whatever stops I make. But I'm thinking about, at my first stop getting a bite to eat and then sitting in the car and recording my thoughts on day 3. And then I might do a follow-up when I get home. But I want to get some of this stuff down when it's fresh. I don't want to wait until I get home to do it, and I also don't want to wait till the next day to do it. So, I'll be making little notes along the way, but I just don't want to wait too long. So it's been a great convention. I don't always know how these things are going to go. I think I've had a lot of luck so far with the panels. I don't think there's been a dud in the bunch, and as much as I hate to admit it, I have been to some panels that I felt were duds, where I felt like, why did I even bother to go to this? Where you get somebody who's just completely uninterested. So far, all of the panels have been great. They've all been different. They have not all been the same. The Bob Camp panel was one thing, and it was completely different from, say, the Bob Camp, which was the Ren and Stimpy panel yesterday. It was completely different from, say, the reprints panel yesterday, which was much nerdier. And you had a lot of variety even to today's panels. So I'm looking forward to the final day. I'm not looking forward to going back to the real world. I'm enjoying myself here in Charlotte at Heroes Con, but it can't go on forever. So 24 hours from now, I expect I will be on the road on my way home. Maybe I'll be close to home. In fact, I should be close to home, certainly considerably closer to home than I am now. Should probably be home by 1, 2 in the morning at the latest. And I'm not working on Monday, so that's a good thing. So I hope to get these out in record time. These recordings I've made, and possibly get a lot of that work done, prepared on Monday. But so I think that's it for day 2 of Heroes Con 2016. That's it for episode 115 of Dave Talks Comics. But my coverage of Heroes Con 2016 continues in episode 116, where I will be talking about the 3rd and final day of the convention. I'm Dave. Thank you for listening.